Thank you for your interest in the Milescraft Pantograph Pro model number 1221. Before getting started, take a moment to ensure that all the necessary components as listed in the manual are present and in good condition. If you do find that something is missing or broken, please contact Milescraft immediately so we can remedy the problem. First, we'll get started by assembling the Pantograph Pro. The main frame of your Pantograph Pro comes fully assembled from the factory. To attach the pivot mounts and stylus to the frame, start by threading the stop nuts onto the support bolts. Next, thread the support bolts into the two rear elbow assemblies until they protrude about a ½ inch below the elbows. Thread each of the pivot socket tips onto the two rear support bolts. Then snap the pivot mounts into the socket end of the pivot socket tip. To assemble the stylus, loosen the elbow nut and turn the handle towards the user. Then retighten the elbow nut to secure it in place. Thread the remaining support bolt into the handle assembly so it protrudes below the bottom of the handle assembly. Then thread a stylus tip onto the support bolt. Before starting your sign, use a test workpiece to practice using your Pantograph Pro. The test piece should be the same width and thickness as your final workpiece. Mark a center line on this test piece that you will use later on in the setup process for making your project. The material you'll be routing needs to be properly secured and supported. We recommend you create a support fixture using a piece of plywood cut to 48 inches long by 20 inches wide. This fixture will save you time later, especially when making numerous signs. Start by creating two support fences that are each 3½ inches wide by 10 inches long and 3/4 inch thick. Position the first support fence along the left edge of the support board approximately 23 inches up from the bottom edge. It's crucial the support fence is square to the edge of the support board when you attach it. Next, place the test workpiece against the support fence and then measure 2 3/8 inch in front of it. This measurement is for attaching the second support fence that will help to wedge the stock in place while you're routing the sign. Just like with the first support fence, it's important this support fence is also square to the support board when it's attached. To wedge the workpiece securely in place when using your Pantograph Pro, simply push the wedges together between the stock and the second support fence. Then gently tap the wedges together until they're tight and the material is held securely in place. To finish the setup of your support fixture, insert a letter stencil into the clear protective sheet and properly secure it in place at the bottom right-hand corner of the support board using push pins. Then position the main frame of the Pantograph Pro so the center of the base plate is over the center line of the test workpiece and the stylus tip is over the center of the letter stencil. With the Pantograph Pro centered on your workpiece, mark the location of the mounting holes in the left-hand pivot mount on the support board. Remove the pivot mount from the left-hand side of the main frame, then attach the pivot mount to the support board by driving 2 screws through the holes in the pivot mount. Next, take a few moments to adjust the rear support bolts so the base sled rests flat on the workpiece and the rear arm and support arms are parallel to the work surface. Lock the adjustments in place by tightening the stop nuts on the support bolts. Take the time to then adjust the stylus tip so it is approximately 1/32 of an inch above the surface of the stencil cover, then lock it into position by tightening the stop nut in place. To attach your router to the Pantograph Pro, you first need to attach the supplied turn lock base plate to your router. Start by removing the manufacturer's base plate from the router you intend to use with your Pantograph Pro. Remove the turn lock base plate from the base sled. Insert the appropriate end of the centering pin into the router's collet following the router manufacturer's instructions. Install the provided turn lock bushing into the base plate by twisting the bushing into the opening in the center of the turn lock base plate. While holding the base plate so the recessed mounting slots are facing up and away from the router, lower the turn lock base plate over the centering pin and onto the base of the router. Then rotate the turn lock base plate until the correct mounting screw slots line up with the router's base plate mounting screw holes. Depending on your router, it may be necessary to enlarge one of the mounting screw slots on the turn lock base plate to allow for correct centering and attachment to your router. After you've finished mounting the base plate to your router, remove the bushing and centering pin. Please note that the bushing is only used in the router setup. The Pantograph Pro comes with 3 router bits. Insert the router bit of your choice into your router's collet and secure it as directed by the router's manufacturer. Once installed, leave the bit in a position above the base. You'll adjust the depth of the bit when you're ready to make your first cut. With the turn-lock base plate attached to your router, it's easy to mount your router to the Pantograph Pro. Simply line up the arrow on the base plate with the arrow on the Pantograph base, drop the base plate in the base sled, and turn until it locks in position. Attach the included cord clips to the Pantograph Pro support arm and clip your router's power cord in position safely out of the way. Next, check that when the tip of the stylus is positioned over the center of the stencil sheet, the router bit is in the center of the workpiece. Then check to ensure the workpiece is large enough for the letter you plan to route by moving the stylus to the top and then to the bottom of your stencil letter. The router bit should always be positioned within the edges of the workpiece. To set the depth of cut for your router bit, start by positioning your router over the workpiece. With the router turned off, plunge the router until the tip of the bit contacts the workpiece. Then adjust your router's depth guide to the desired depth of cut as recommended by the router manufacturer's instructions. Next, move the router and base assembly off the workpiece and plunge the router to the preset depth. With the router bit clear to spin freely, turn on the router motor. Then, using the handle to lift and swing the router above the workpiece, position the stylus over the stencil and slowly lower the router to begin routing the first letter. It's important to hold the handles with both hands when routing, as this gives you greater control when tracing the stencil. Work slowly, following the outside line of the stencil, working in a counterclockwise direction. Using small strokes, move the stylus throughout the inside of the stencil to clear out the extra material in your workpiece. Try to avoid stops and starts, as this can lead to imperfections in the workpiece. A slow and steady pace will give you the best results. After you've completed the first letter, lift up and swing your router clear of the workpiece before switching off the router's motor. When the router bit comes to a complete stop, inspect your workpiece to ensure the material has been completely removed from the letter. To ensure the appropriate letter spacing, each stencil has locator dots to help the proper positioning next to each other. With the router motor turned off, pick up the handle and place the stylus on the spacing dot to the right of the stencil sheet. Allow the router bit to rest directly on the surface of the workpiece. Using a pencil, mark the location of the router bit on the workpiece. Then lift and swing the router out of the way. Remove the stencil sheet of the letter you just routed and replace it with the next one. Be sure to position each sheet in the same exact position as the previous to help create straight work on your finished sign. Lift and swing the router back onto the workpiece so the bit is positioned on the pencil mark. Then loosen the workpiece by gently tapping on the end of the locking wedges. Then adjust the workpiece and the router to the left until the stylus is directly over the locating dot to the left of the stencil sheet. Lock the workpiece securely in place by tapping the wedges into position. Then lift and swing the router off the workpiece and repeat the routing action as you did previously for the first letter. Repeat this process for each letter you route, and when you finish routing all of your letters, remove the workpiece and finish your sign as desired.